The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Nebraska prairie, each flake adding to the white shroud that covered the winter-hardened earth. John McCarty had been tracking the wagon for 3 days, following the trail of broken axles and discarded belongings that told the story of desperate people fleeing something terrible. He hadn't expected to find what he did that gray morning in February 1885. The woman was slumped against the base of a gnarled cottonwood, her traditional Chinese clothing stained dark with blood that had frozen in the brutal cold. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, creating small clouds in the frigid air. But what stopped John's heart weren't the woman's injuries. It was the 2 small faces peering at him from behind her weakened form, 2 identical girls who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, their almond-shaped eyes wide with terror and something else, a resignation that no child should ever possess. John had dismounted slowly, his rifle still in hand but pointed at the ground. His dog, a mixed breed named Shadow, whined softly and sat at his heel, sensing the gravity of the moment. The girls didn't move, didn't cry out. They simply held each other's hands tighter, their small fingers intertwined as if that connection was the only thing keeping them tethered to the earth. "Ma'am," John said softly, his voice roughened by years of prairie winds and sparse conversation. "Ma'am, I'm not here to hurt you." The woman's eyes fluttered open. She tried to speak, but only a wet cough emerged. John could see she'd been shot, probably days ago. The wound in her side had festered despite the cold, and he knew with the certainty that comes from years of frontier living that she wouldn't survive the night. Maybe not even the hour. He approached carefully, and that's when one of the girls spoke. Her English was broken but clear, learned perhaps from the few words her mother knew or from the missionaries who had tried to help Chinese immigrants along the railroad routes. "If Mama dies, we die too," she said, her voice flat and factual, as if she were stating the color of the sky. The other girl nodded in agreement, her expression identically solemn. John felt something crack in his chest, a place that had been frozen solid since his wife Sarah had died giving birth to their stillborn son 3 winters ago. He'd become hard after that, living alone on his ranch, speaking more to his horses than to people, avoiding the town except when absolutely necessary. "Now, why would you say something like that?" he asked, kneeling in the snow despite the cold seeping through his worn pants. The first girl looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Because we are Chinese. Because Mama says Americans don't want us. Because the men who hurt Mama said they would find us. Because we have nowhere to go." The woman stirred, using what must have been the last of her strength to speak. Her words came in Cantonese, urgent and desperate, and though John couldn't understand the language, he understood the tone. Every mother on earth speaks the same language when it comes to protecting their children. The girl translated, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. "Mama says. She says please don't let us die in the cold. She says we are good girls. We work hard. We don't eat much. She says." The girl's voice broke, and her sister continued for her. "She says she knows you are a good man because you have kind eyes. She says please, please, take us somewhere safe. She says tell you our names. Yummy. This is my sisterling. We are 7 years old." John looked at the dying woman, at her daughters, at the vast empty prairie stretching in all directions. He thought about the Chinese railroad workers he'd seen, how they'd been treated after the railroad was completed, how the Chinese Exclusion Act had made their lives even harder, how violence against them had become commonplace. He thought about the men who had done this, probably the same ones who'd been terrorizing Chinese families up and down the frontier, stealing, killing, justifying their cruelty with laws and prejudice. Then he thought about Sarah, about the child they'd never had, about the emptiness of his ranch house and the silence that had become his only companion. "Your mama's right about one thing," he said quietly, looking directly at the woman. "You want to let them die in the cold." The woman's expression shifted, and even through her pain, John could see relief wash over her features. She reached out with a trembling hand and grasped his, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so close to death. She spoke again in Cantonese, and this time both girls translated together, their voices overlapping. "She says thank you. She says she can rest now. She says love them like they are your own blood. She says they will be good daughters to you." John stayed with them as the woman died, which took another hour. He built a small fire, wrapped his coat around the shivering girls, and held the mother's hand until her breathing stopped. Mei and Ling didn't wail or cry out. They simply held each other and watched their mother slip away with the stoic acceptance of children who had learned too early that the world was cruel and capricious. Afterward, John buried the woman as best he could in the frozen ground, marking the spot with stones so he could return in the spring to give her a proper burial. He lifted both girls onto his horse, one in front of him and one behind, and they began the long ride back to his ranch. Shadow trotted alongside, occasionally looking up at the new additions to their small pack. The town of Millbrook buzzed with gossip when John McCarty rode in 3 days later with 2 Chinese girls. He'd come for supplies and to speak with the sheriff, though he had little hope that anything would be done about the men who had killed the girl's mother. His reception was about what he expected: stares, whispers, and more than a few hostile glares. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson refused to serve him at first.
John McCarty, have you lost your mind?
Those are Chinese children. You can't just.
Can't he just what, Martha?
John interrupted, his voice hard. Can't just keep 2 orphan girls from freezing to death?
Can't he just honor a dying woman's last wish?
Can't just do what any decent human being would do. But they're Chinese, she sputtered, as if that explained everything. They're children, John replied. Now, are you going to sell me supplies, or do I need to ride to the next town? Word spread quickly. Some folks were supportive, or at least kept their opinions to themselves. Others were openly hostile. The mayor suggested that John send the girls to San Francisco, where there were Chinese communities. The preacher mentioned an orphanage in Denver. A few men implied, or stated outright, that John would be better off leaving the girls on someone else's doorstep in the middle of the night. John ignored them all. He took Mei and Ling home to his ranch and began the awkward process of becoming something he'd never imagined he'd be: a father. Those first months were difficult. The girls were traumatized, grieving, and terrified that John would change his mind and abandon them. They barely spoke, ate almost nothing, and woke screaming from nightmares. They didn't believe they were allowed to exist in his space, tried to make themselves invisible, flinched when he moved too quickly. John had no idea what he was doing. He'd never been around children much, had no frame of reference for how to comfort them or make them feel safe. But he was patient, in the way that ranchers learn patience from animals and the land. He gave them space but stayed nearby. He spoke softly and moved predictably. He made sure they knew where the food was and that they could eat whenever they wanted. He showed them the room that would be theirs, Sarah's sewing room, untouched for 3 years, and left them alone to explore it. Slowly, incrementally, things began to change. May started following him around the ranch, watching him work with the horses. Ling began helping in the kitchen, learning to cook the simple meals John made. They taught him a few words of Cantonese, and he taught them more English. Shadow became their constant companion, sleeping outside their door each night, and the girls' nightmares gradually became less frequent. Spring came, and with it, more trouble. A group of men rode onto John's property one afternoon, led by a rancher named Jack Sullivan who'd been vocal about his dislike of the Chinese since the railroad days.
McCarty, Sullivan called out, not bothering to dismount. We're here to talk sense into you.
Those girls need to go. You're encouraging more of them to come here, making people think they're welcome. It's not right. John stepped out onto his porch, his rifle conspicuously leaning against the doorframe within easy reach. Behind him, he could sense Mei and Ling frozen in fear. He'd taught them to hide when strangers came, but they'd refused to leave him. The only thing that's not right, Sullivan, is a group of armed men coming onto my property uninvited, John said calmly. These girls are under my protection. They're staying. And if you or anyone else has a problem with that, you can take it up with Judge Morrison next time he's in town. Judge Morrison can't change the law, one of the other men shouted.
The Chinese Exclusion Act
doesn't apply to children who are already here and already orphaned, John interrupted. He was bluffing. He had no idea what the law actually said, but he spoke with such conviction that the men hesitated.
Now get off my land.
The confrontation ended without violence, but John knew it wasn't over. That night, he sat the girls down and had a serious conversation with them. I need you to understand something, he said. There are going to be people who don't like you just because of where your mother came from. There are going to be people who say cruel things, who try to make you feel like you don't belong. But this is your home now. You're my daughters, legally and in every way that matters. And I will protect you with everything I have. May, the bolder of the two, looked at him with those serious dark eyes. Why? She asked. Why do you care about us? John thought about that question for a long time before answering. Because your mama asked me to. Because you deserved better than what happened to you. And because... He paused, surprised to feel his throat tightening with emotion. Because I needed you too. I just didn't know it until I found you. Years passed. John legally adopted May and Ling, facing down a judge who was initially skeptical but ultimately couldn't find a legal reason to refuse the petition. The girls grew, learned, and thrived. They became expert horsewomen, helped run the ranch, and slowly began to heal from their trauma. They never forgot their birth mother, and John made sure they maintained connections to their Chinese heritage as best he could, even taking them to San Francisco once to experience the Chinese community there. The town of Millbrook slowly, grudgingly accepted them, though it helped that May once pulled the mayor's son from a river and saved his life, and that Ling's cooking became locally famous. By the time they were teenagers, most people had forgotten that there had ever been controversy about John McCarty's adopted daughters. But John never forgot that day in the snow, those words that had cut straight to his heart. If Mama dies, we'll die too. He'd proven those words wrong, and in doing so, had saved not just 2 lives but 3. Because the truth was, he'd been dying too, slowly freezing in his own winter of grief and isolation. May and Ling had given him back his life, just as he'd given them theirs. They'd become family not through blood but through choice, through commitment, through the simple act of showing up for each other day after day. And that, John learned, was sometimes the strongest kind of family there was.